All right, so I have a bunch of fixes and fitting solutions for patterns that have a princess seam that goes to the armhole here. Boy, this one has quite the armhole gape. I think I went a little overboard on this example here. I'm going to show you how to do these solutions on the princess seam with the shoulder. I'm going to show you how to do these fitting solutions, and it doesn't matter if your pattern has a center back seam or a center back fold. I'm going to show you ways to deal with either. With this armhole gape here, we can actually utilize this princess seam to get rid of it. So we can slide it down in here and pinch it out right along that seam. So let's try and do our best here to see how much we want to get rid of. And we'll pin it, and I'll show you how to do that. And obviously that doesn't affect any of the other seams. That's pretty straightforward. All right, let me show you some flat and round fitting issues. All right, so this pattern here is very loose in this back area here. And you just need to determine, is this in this upper shoulder area here across the back or the low neck, or is it in this lower shoulder blade area? So this would be loose back here, it'd be creeping up onto your neck there. Maybe the waist would kind of dip, but everything else is looking pretty good except for all this bagginess up here. So you need to determine how much by pinching it out, and make sure you pinch it out along the center back here. We're going to create a wedge going from center back outwards, and I'm going to show you how to deal with this if your pattern's on the fold or has a center back seam. All right, now this one has the opposite issue. It's just not quite reaching the neck there. It's probably pulling on your front neck and pretty uncomfortable and feeling just a little bit tight going through here. So you need to determine, is this up high, is it down low? Sometimes either adjustment will work for either issue. We're gonna cut this straight across, just maybe to the armhole shoulder area there, and see if we relax this, is this what this needs? I don't have any seam allowance on my armhole, so I can create a little hinge there. And we'll pin this back in place. It's a little loosey-goosey now. Relax that shoulder a little too much, but it'll be okay once we make our adjustment and get everything back in order. So we can kind of see that that definitely calmed that down, and we can bring that up to the neck. If you want, you can always put this back together, tape it, or sew it to a piece of scrap fabric, and then try it at your lower back and see if that helps, because it's kind of hard sometimes to discern one from the other. You may not be able to tell, especially if the other piece is sewn to it. So you can make a slice here and spread it apart and see if that works. So I'm going to show you how to do this adjustment. Let's go to the pattern table and make all of our adjustments on the patterns. All right, so we're gonna address this armhole gape here. So let's measure the amount that we want to get rid of, and we're gonna take it symmetrically, half on this seam and half on this seam. The most accurate way to do this is always work on your seam line. So I'm gonna work on this white area here, right? So we're going to measure along this seam line here. This is our seam line that we're removing, this length here. So we wanna take that amount and draw a hatch mark on there, and the same with this seam line there. And now we're going to blend in, I'm blending my seam line in with that hatch mark. Now I'm trying to get over there as soon as possible without creating any kind of strange bumps that might be harder to sew. So let's do the same thing here. And now we're going to draw back in our seam allowance to that edge. It'll look less severe once we do that. And once you get here, you're just going to blend it in with that cut edge there. It's very messy with the Sharpie. And same thing here. And remember, we're blending in with the original cut edge there. And then when I get to the scissors, sometimes it's a little easier. And sometimes if it's a little too hard to tell, I'll flip the paper over and I'll do it from the other side. So there we go. Let's get that. Look at it. It looks good, right? Looks kind of funny on this side, but this side, it looks totally fine. And then we'll trim this off here, blending in with that cut line. Same thing. Now you want to make sure that your seam line still matches, and if you only could take that amount off of one of these pieces, you felt like that upper piece was great, you wanted to remove all of it on the lower piece or vice versa, you're definitely going to need to check your seam line. And what I would do is leave your seam the same down here, and if it's short or long up here, that's where I would adjust it. Either add some paper back here and lengthen the seam line, and then make sure that you have a nice smooth transition here. and then you'll be all set. You can kind of tell we do have a little bit of a jog. When I put this seam line on top of the other one, I make sure my junctures stack one on top of the other. We have this little bit of a point. Now you can do one of two things. You can carve this out in order to make your transition, right, like that, or we could add it in. So you're gonna have to be the judge of that and what your armhole was looking like. On this one here, I'd probably add it in just because it does look like it pulled in a little bit. And then I could always look at a sample and make sure. So I would add some paper there, tape it on, and then trim it to blend it in. And then we'd have our armhole gape all good. So our only other consequence with this is that we have changed the armhole length. So this is one of those changes where we're going to have to make some adjustments if we have a sleeve. Now, if you have a sleeveless garment here, this is probably why you've noticed the armhole gape even more. You probably have either a lining or a facing that you're going to need to address. And I would just redraft that facing, and I'll show you how in a second. But if you have a sleeve, what you're gonna wanna do is take out that little wedge that we just took out here on the sleeve as well. And so I usually try and figure out about where that was, and that's about right here, roughly, right above the notch. And I'll slice down to the hem, and I'll measure on the seam line the amount that I took out. And this one's gonna be a little harder to get lined up, but look at my cut line here. I'm gonna line it up in line with that, not that hatch mark there. Tape it. And now I need to blend that amount there. Now, did your sleeve need to come in? Does it need to go to the original there? I usually just split the difference when it's quite a big jog like this. As a pattern drafter drafting a sleeve, your sleeve, when you fold it in half, is almost perfectly symmetrical. It's usually carved out a little right here at the front, and that's it. So when you get into the land of fitting a sleeve in a custom way, it's okay that the sleeve is no longer going to be symmetrical. What we're trying to do here is make it match, remove the same exact amount, don't upset the amount we're easing the sleeve into the armhole, and we need our underarms to stay sewing to one another. So that's why we're kind of doing this splice up here rather than just adding it right here. So we take it out up here because if we took it away right here, it would actually make this seam longer because we'd be chopping it up here and it's higher up compared to that edge there. And it also isn't where we removed that volume. So we're going to do it right where we had it. So let's split the difference here. And now our sleeve is still going to sew to itself here at the underarm. We may have to address this little jog here. You can see that there's a little bit of a hill. And I would just trim that off unless you feel like you need to add to compensate for it. Secure all these little edges here. And then now this back sleeve is going to still sew to this back armhole. All right, let's draft a little armhole facing just in case that your armhole gape issue changed so much that so just in case you were doing a sleeveless and you need a new armhole facing now. So what I would do is I'm gonna trace off my shoulder, my armhole, part of my princess line there, and then I'm going to overlap my pattern piece on here as if it's sewn, just like this. And we want the juncture of the seam line there to hit that line there. Hopefully we've smoothed the armhole by now. So we'll pretend like we did. We'll smooth this out just like this. And now we're gonna finish tracing the armhole and the side seam there. That's about all we need. So we wanna keep this facing width the same width your original facing was. So check what that width is. You're gonna measure from your armhole into the garment the amount of that facing width there. And we're gonna go straight around this armhole. When you get into this curve, you're gonna need more hatch marks closer together. That's why I like this, the other kind of ruler. There's more hatch marks on the ruler too. All right, when you get to the underarm and the shoulder, I would take the front facing, line it up and make sure, you know, that it's going to be a nice smooth transition going to it. And then that way it'll sew nicely together. All right, so because this already has a side seam and a shoulder seam, we can now just cut this out and we'll know that it's going to fit. If this were a neck facing, however, we would put the, most likely a center back neck facing would be on the fold. So there is our armhole. You might want to put a notch here at the juncture of your princess seam, and then you'll know at least that that is where that sews to, so you don't accidentally try sewing it on upside down, because yours probably looks a little less kooky than this one. So if you were doing a center back neck facing, you want the center back to be on the fold. You don't really need a seam allowance here. Just make sure you have a right angle there, and you're going to trace the neck and the shoulder and do your parallel line around, and then make sure you have your right angle there and the bottom of the facing, and you're good to go. And let's just compare here. So here's our old one. And that's what we did. We took away that little wedge there that was creating that wing in our armhole. There it is. All right, so let's address this high back area. Now, the good news is if you've ever watched the set-in armhole stuff, it's identical to that. Or if you've ever had to do it, it's identical to that. So we're keeping this on the fold here at the center back, and we're gonna do our slice right at the neck if we're either rounding it or flattening it. Remember, if we're flattening it, we're taking fabric away. If we're rounding it, we're creating this little wedge that you see in this pink paper here. All right, so we're gonna draw a line right at that neckline seam over to either your armhole or your shoulder, wherever it lands. And then we're going to create a hinge right here. So we want to cut up to the hinge on either side of the seam line. Like that. And now whether you are rounding or flattening, now you want to spread apart or overlap this little area. So let's do a rounded one. We're going to tape the paper to the lower piece here. We're going to draw our center back line straight up. Draw the amount as a little hatch mark on the center back line here, the amount that we want to add. Have a piece of tape ready, and now we're going to raise this little section up to so that the neckline seam lands right on that hatch mark, just like that. Now let's secure it just like this. And then the last thing we need to do, we just need to make sure that we have a right angle here at center back neck, and we should be good to go like that. Now this isn't going to affect your shoulder seam or your armhole. The only thing that this one really affects is if you have a center back neck facing, and I'll show you how to draft that in just. So the only thing that this might affect is whether you flatten it or round it. And remember, if you flattened it, you've pulled this down. You've made your hatch mark on the lower back here like this. And we pulled this neck area down to meet it. And same thing, we make sure we have a right angle at center back neck, and we true it up a little bit. It won't affect all the seams, but just like with the rounded, if you have a center back neck facing, it will affect the shape of the facing, and you're going to need to redraft that. So see the previous section on how to draft a facing to match your neckline. All right, so let's do a low back adjustment for this princess seam. So this one is a little different, and to be honest, you could actually do this on a few other patterns if you really don't want to change the neck or change the shoulder. It might not work for a really big amount that you're trying to change along that center back, but this will open it up or decrease it if you're doing flat. So first we're going to draw a line straight from center back over to the armhole over here, and it can be a little lower if you like. And we're not going to go actually quite to the armhole. We're going to also go up to the shoulder, and this is going to be our cut line, one long bit here, and our hinge is going to be right here, right at the seam line there. So I'll show you how to do that for flat and for rounded. So let me trace this other one. And essentially you don't even really need to
put this line here, but if you've cut all your seam allowances off, you're gonna need to go just inside. So if you still have your seam allowance on your pattern, this change will be a little bit easier. For this one here, we'll do a flat adjustment, and this one we'll do a rounded adjustment. So we're gonna cut from center back up to the shoulder here, and we're gonna try and stick close to that seam line over here, just like this, and then down to it for the hinge. All right, I'm gonna slip a piece of paper behind the rounded, and we're going to secure it along this bottom edge here. We're gonna square up from our center back to continue our center back line here. And now we're gonna raise it the amount we want. So I'm gonna put a really big adjustment here. This would be 1 inch if this were a regular sized pattern, which I think is probably more than you're gonna ever add back here. If you need to add a lot, I would do a few different cuts, do a gradual amount. So let's see what happens here. We're gonna tilt this back, and what we really wanna do is secure this edge over here. This edge right here isn't gonna move. So I'm gonna tape mine down since I have some seam allowance to tape down. And now we're gonna raise this up, just like this, to that hatch mark there. Let's extend our center back line even more. We want it to go above the neck so we can see it. All right, so now we've got this secured down here, and we're gonna tilt this up to that hatch mark there. And you can see that my neck is staying on that center back line there. So you'll see that if we draw the line on top, it's going right through the neck. And like I said, this would be a really big adjustment, so I'm exaggerating it so you can see it. Now let's secure it. This is an adjustment I kind of figured out by accident, and it works really good because now we haven't changed our neckline, our shoulder, our armhole, nothing. All we've done is raise up this back. So the one thing we need to make sure we double check is that we have a right angle here at the center back neck, and I clearly right now do not have one. If I lay my ruler there, you can see that it's quite a bit different, like that little bit there. So this is where you need to kind of decide, do I want to raise it or lower it a little bit? I'm gonna lower it that little bit there, mainly because I really don't think you're gonna have this big of a difference on yours because you're not gonna be adjusting it this much. So, but you can always, if you really don't want to lower it because you're just trying to get every bit you can out of that length there, you can also raise up this bit right here instead. So instead we would square up here. You just don't want this neck area right here to dip below your center back there because they'll have a point when it's sewn together there or put on the fold. So you can either do this or you can do this. And if you do this lower one, you're going to need to trim off a little at the top there. The goal right here is to keep this neckline the same length so that any collars will still sew to this. If you change this length at all, you can adjust that to get it back to the length you need by lowering or raising the shoulder line here. Remember, you're measuring along the seam line here because this is the length. So if you needed to shave off a little bit, you can lower this line a tiny bit or raise it up if you needed to add it back. So most likely you're probably not going to have any issues at all. So this is what we would do for a rounded back. If we wanted to increase the space there and still maintain our center back fold here. You just trim that right off, just like that. You might need to trim off this little wing of seam allowance there. And then we'll go with our new neckline and we'll trim our center back. And we've still kept that on the fold. You can compare it here. There we go. That looks really good with no shoulder darts, no neck darts at all. All right, and if we're gonna do flat, we're doing the exact same thing, just in the other direction. We'll do an extreme amount on this one too, just so we can see what happens. It's tape ready, and we're gonna pull this down till it touches that hatch mark there. Make sure your paper's always flat. We're gonna need a little piece of paper behind it to fill in this little wedge here. We're not adding any like volume there. We just need to fill it in so we have a nice straight line. If there's any chance that this swings out and sticks out past your armhole here, just trim that off. It'll be fine. We're adding it back over here anyway. And then the last thing we have to do is just make sure we have our right angle here. Let's square up our center back and try and get our right angle. We'll go shallower this time since we were doing a flatter amount. And then we'll put our seam allowance back in. There we go. Trim all this. And now let's compare. And we've pulled that out just like that without changing any of our seams. Really good. All right, lastly, I'm going to show you how to do these adjustments, the high back and the low back adjustments on a garment that has a center back seam. So this is identical to how a set-in sleeve would be, or set-in armhole would be. We're going to draw our line straight from center back. Now that high back one can be within an inch of this neck seam. It doesn't have to be right at the neck seam, which makes it a little less fussy to do. And we're going to square all the way across to the armhole. And if we want one in the low back, same thing, we're going to square across to the armhole. And this isn't going to affect your side back piece because it goes to the armhole and we're not going that low. All right, we need hinges right here at the armhole. All right, now, and if you want to flatten your back, you're going to pivot these down, right? And I would start with the bottom one, overlap, tape it. Let's get a better hit, there we go. And then do the one above it. I'd be kind of methodical and work my way up. If you're rounding it, same thing. We're going to tape a piece of paper. We're going to lift this up, and then we're going to lift our other one. So this time, let's see. Let's do a rounded again. So we'll tape this down. We always tape the bottom edge first, and then we need to draw our center back straight up on our new piece of paper. Hatch mark about for the amount that we want to raise it. Raise that middle section up, secure it down. We're going to repeat for this section, but we're going to use this little section here to create our center back line, because we're kind of just using the section above. And then we'll square up again. Then we'll put our hatch mark here, line up that cut edge with that hatch mark. Make sure that your pattern is nice and flat. You don't want any contour in your pattern piece. That's why we're doing these wedges. We're adding the contour in a different way. All right, so now we have this nice fanned out shape here. We just need to add our center back seam. Let's see if we can make it on this piece of paper here. If you already had a center back seam, you just need to blend in this little edge here where you added. And now we're going to add the amount that we wanted for our center back seam. It's a really great way. If you're going with princess lines already, you're probably already trying to get a really fitted garment. Adding the center back seam gives you one more place to do that. All right, and we're just going to trim off this paper here. This edge is probably just fine the way it is. You don't need to do any other truing to it. And then we're going to make sure we have a right angle here at center back neck. And we're going to make sure we have one here at center back waist, just like that. We'll trim off our paper. All right, and there we go. We have a nice rounded back there with a center back seam. And if you were doing a flat back, we'd be overlapping in a different way. I don't think this will affect any of your pattern pieces unless you add this higher back one really close to the back neck. You might find that the facing, if you have one, isn't quite the same shape anymore. So you may need to redraw your facing. You can see the previous sections for how to do that. But your armhole and your shoulder and your princess seam are all unchanged. All you've done is add the center back seam, and look at that, it'll be nice shape right across the back. Or if it were a flatter back, you'd have a curve going like this on your center back there, kind of scrunching down, getting rid of that extra fabric. Good luck fitting your princess seams to the armhole. I hope you're enjoying my Fitopedia fitting series, and if you want to get more fitting tutorials, just check the description. There's going to be links to more. And if you would like a printed version of these mini tutorials, just check the description or look under the video, and eventually you'll be able to make your own little Fitopedia booklet. And it'll be a really great, quick, easy reference to how to diagnose and fit the issue that you're working on. So I hope you're getting a lot out of the series. Please let me know, like, comment, and subscribe, and follow along for more. Thanks for watching.